Today's text about spiritual gifts is one of my favorites. It comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. And I know to our modern ears, some of these gifts sound kind of strange. I know we can appreciate what it means to have various gifts and talents. Our choir members clearly have great musical gifts. Many of you out there I know have great athletic talent. Others have considerable organizational skills or business acumen. Many of you have great minds for teaching, medicine, science, or engineering. Still others of you I know are incredibly gifted with your hands, from physical therapists and master gardeners to woodworkers to various tradesmen and quilters and knitters, flower arrangers, and I have 10 pounds that will testify that you're all great cooks. But we don't tend to think of these things in religious terms. Like Paul, we do celebrate some of the gifts that he lists here first. The first four, for example, wisdom and knowledge, faith and healing. We might hope that our child might have those four gifts. He or she might grow up to be a good doctor, for instance. But it's the last five in the list that seem a little more weird. I don't know many parents who will say to another one on the playground, "Well, I certainly hope little Johnny grows up to have the gift of miracles or prophecy, or perhaps the gift of tongues or the interpretation of tongues." But what we have here in Paul's writing is a description of kind of a worship committee problem, a clash of cultures that was going on in Corinth at that time as Greeks were being converted by a Jewish man to a new faith of Christianity. Diversity was a problem. The Greeks enjoyed a lot of, let us say, rowdy worship, where even drugs and alcohol were a big part of it, but certainly dancing and ecstatic utterance in tongues, which for a scholarly rabbinical type like Paul was a bit difficult to get around. So he thought it important to write about spiritual gifts, to help his people sort them out. As different, though, as that is to us, those don't seem to be our problem here. I think we do suffer a clash of cultures in our world today, and I want to talk to you a little more about that. Because I think Paul has a lot to speak to us today as he says, "I do not want you to be uninformed about spiritual gifts." As Christians, I believe we should be well informed about spiritual gifts. We should be learning how to discern them in ourselves and in others, and especially in our children, but also how to put them to good use in our church and in the world. I enjoyed that the word that is in Greek, energematon, is translated in our reading as activates, that God activates our gifts for use in the world. God energizes us. When we are using our gifts to their fullest, that is when we feel, I believe, the most joy and the most energy. And that's why I'm excited about starting this new class to help those of us who may wonder about our spiritual gifts, who may feel a little lost in our path or discouraged in our work, to help us find more about our spiritual gifts. During the past century, we've had a wealth of new studies in this area, in development of new personality and aptitude tests. No longer do we have only ancient astrology to let us know what type we might be. There are modern psychological tools that can be graded on the computer, IQ tests. One I was familiar with, the Myers-Briggs personality test, and Richard Stewart has shared with the clergy a new thing he uses at work called strengths finders. They're all very useful, and from them come many helpful words that help us divide the world between types and to maybe make peace between types so that we don't have to all be all things to all people. We know a little bit about extroverts and introverts. We understand that some people are most comfortable being highly organized and methodical, whereas others are really good at spontaneity and improvisation. We know that there are thinking and feeling types. There are those who work best with their hands, and then others who seem to be more comfortable in the world of ideas. Educators have discovered that children seem to have multiple learning styles, visual, auditory, tactile, and multiple intelligences. Those who tend to get the best grades traditionally are those who are mathematically or verbally gifted. But there's also now more recognition for those who have musical gifts or visual, spatial, artistic gifts, kinesthetic gifts, those athletes. And still others have gifts that are emotional, intrapersonal, which are introspective, or interpersonal, about relationships between people. And those three gifts especially seem spiritual gifts that we might appreciate more in church than on a college application. So that's one reason, at least, with all these psychological types and tests available, that appreciating spiritual gifts is so important. I know when my grandmother's family was homesteading in a dugout in Oklahoma 100 years ago, both her parents and grandparents and all 10 children in the family had essentially the same job description: survivalist, farm worker, Christian, just plain Christian. I doubt they had the leisure to sit around for very long to discern what their spiritual gifts were. And yet, at some level, they must have known that not everyone is the best caring nurturer. Some are better with their hands. Some are better with their head. Faith was simple then, as was life. But by the time I came along as a baby boomer growing up in the 1960s, life had become much more complex. Many, many more careers were open in the world, even to women. And as we suburban kids were growing up, we weren't doing farm chores side by side with our parents and grandparents. Instead, we were on the go from dawn to dusk with school and after-school lessons and clubs and activities. Our parents, I know, were trying to expose us to everything that was available in the hopes that something would catch fire in us and we would discover or bring out our own natural gifts. But we often heard